Well, thank you very much. It's really great to be here at this Creation Conference. It's really great to be here in your wonderful country. Travelled all the way from Australia. We arrived not yesterday, but the day before. And we've been able to catch up on our sleep. And so I think I'm almost in sync with you now. This morning I want to talk to you a little bit about a biblical model of geology. It's not going to be very complicated. We're not going to hear about Planck's constant and all those sorts of things, the charge on the electron. It's just going to be a very simple model about how we understand geology and geography from what the Bible says. You see, because when we're studying science, when we're looking at the world, as Ken said this morning, from a scientific point of view, we look at the world around about us, we want to be able to understand it and try to make it fit and to be able to see what's happening and how it's happening and why it's happening and what's going to happen. And so what scientists do is they construct models of the world. And scientists have got models of just about everything. We've got models of the electron, models of the atom, models of gases. We heard this morning about a model of plate tectonics. So scientists use models, which is a representation of the world, to try to understand the world. So when we're talking about geology, of course, scientists need a model of what happened geologically. And so what we do, when we're thinking from a biblical worldview, we start with the Bible. It's a really radical way to start, and at this stage, I'm not going to try to prove it. If you're somebody that's maybe you've got doubts and questions about the Bible, what I'm saying, okay, let's just for the sake of the argument assume the Bible's true. As someone who believes the Bible and I understand that the Word of God is true, I believe it's true. And so because of that, because it's the Word of God of someone who's there, I start with the Bible in my thinking. And then when we come to the issue of geology, we start with a geological model, and we use those models, as in all scientific models, to help us explore geology, to help us classify the different rocks around the world, and to help us to understand the geology of the earth. So we start with a biblical worldview. Now the Bible, as Ken mentioned this morning, it's not a science book, but it's really a history book of the whole universe. It starts out how the world was made, and it goes on various things and events that happen in Earth history. So although it's not a science book, where the history of the Bible impacts and touches on scientific things like geology, that's where we believe it, and that's where we have to start with our thinking. We've heard of the 7 C's of history, and that's our understanding from geology, our understanding of the sweep of world history is this creation, corruption, catastrophe, confusion, Christ, cross, and consummation. So we start with the 7 C's of history. We start with this biblical worldview. We start with the biblical history and understanding our geological history of the earth. Now, evolutionists, of course, they need a history to understand what happened geologically. And so what they do is they invent a history. They make certain assumptions and they say, well, maybe it was like this. Maybe it was like that. And they invent their own history. But we don't have to do that because we've got someone who was there. And when we look at the history of the universe, there's certain key events which happened. And one of the events, of course, is creation. And from a geological perspective, what we do is we look at what the Bible says and we try to see in what the Bible says from a geological perspective. Now, when it says, now in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, the whole of the earth was created there right in the very beginning in the creation period. And the earth it was inhabited, populated with plants and animals and people. And so that creation event was very significant geologically. And when we look at, say, how significant it was, well, the whole earth was made. And we can do a little calculation, it's not particularly difficult, working on the diameter of the earth and the volume of a sphere, and work out that at that time there was about 1 million cubic kilometers of material, which was geologic material, which was formed right there at the creation event. Just remember the number, a million of these things, a million cubic kilometers of material. And then, of course, the next major event that happened, that affected the world geologically, was the flood. the flood event. And at that time, the Bible tells us that the earth was reformed, it was remade, and as a result of the flood that covered the whole world. And we don't know exactly how much, but the outside of the earth, we certainly know that the surface of the earth at the moment, that 70% of the surface of the earth is covered in sedimentary rocks, and it affected a large part of the surface of the earth. Not as much rocks were affected during the flood as during the creation. And if we do a little calculation, an estimate, instead of 1 million, we get 300 by 1 million cubic kilometres. So the number is 300. It's a much less amount that was affected during the flood. And if we looked at a planet about the equivalent of that material, it'd be a planet about that size during the flood. Now, after the flood, there's been various geological things which have happened. We see, for example, landslides which cover highways, and then there are various floods which wash mud and material and bury houses and things like that. And so there's geology which is happening in the world today. We see things like these waterfalls which are eroding the countryside and carrying rock and sand down into the ocean and dumping it there. And we can estimate just how much rock is being moved around on the earth today, in these days. And when you work it out, it comes out to a number in the post-flood era, in the 4,500 years since the flood, of about 0.05. So we had 1 million, then 300, and now 0.05. Very, very small amount of material compared with creation and the flood. And if we had a planet the size of that, can you see? I've just put it up there on the screen, a little dot right there on the screen, and it's so small, it's almost insignificant. And we can look at the period of time before the flood, between the creation event and the flood. It was a period of 1,656 years, and we can calculate that from the genealogies there in Genesis chapter 5, the ages of Adam and Seth and Enosh, and these different people when they had their sons, and we can calculate it was about 1,656 years between the creation and the flood. And during that time, if we assume that, processes were similar at that stage to what they are today, then the amount of rock material which would have been produced in that time was also would have been very, very small. So we come to what we call, we've had the 7 seas, or it's really a timeline of Bible history. Some 4,000 years BC, the creation. Some 2,500 years BC, around about that, the flood. And here we are at the present time, some 2,000 years after Christ. And we can simplify this timeline in this way. So we've got the main events, the creation event. We've got the pre-flood era, the flood event, and the post-flood era, and those different colours there on the diagram. And so there, from a geological perspective, we've divided up that timeline into the things which are significant geologically. So there we've got it there, and what we can do is we can tilt it around. It's not very complicated. So we've got the earliest time at the bottom and the latest time at the top, and we can say, okay, there's that timeline, that time scale from the Bible perspective, the biblical time scale, and we can think, now, what were the rocks which formed at each of those times? The creation event, we calculated out. There was a small amount of time, 6 days, a huge amount of rock material, the creation rocks which formed. And we've just got the top little part of them showing there. But then in the pre-flood era, it was a large amount of time, 1,656 years, and yet it was only a small amount of rock. And then there was the flood, it lasted a whole year, and that produced a large amount of rock. And the post-flood era, a large amount of time, but that only produced a small amount of rock material. And so there we've got a very, very simple model. It's a biblical geological model which relates the Bible time scale, the history that's recorded in the Bible, relates it to the rocks that we'd expect to find on the earth. We haven't gone out to have a look at any yet. We've just had a look at what the Bible says. We've looked at read it from a geological glasses, put them on, so that we can sort of say, well, this is what we'd expect to find on the earth. That's our first guess, our first estimate, our first little model. I'm sorry, it's not very complicated. It's just very simple like that, isn't it? A biblical geological model. There it is. And from that model, really, it's based on the Bible. Very simple. And also what it is, it relates the biblical history to the geology of the earth. It's a practical tool because we can go out and walk around the countryside and we can sort of say, well, this is the sort of rocks that we'd expect to find. And it communicates a very simple concept. That is that a lot of the rock, that there's an uneven relation between time and rocks. Small amount of time at creation, large amount of rocks. Large amount of time in the post-flood era, a small amount of rocks. And so there's a little concept, biblical geologic model. But scientists, of course, like to get into details of things and try to work out, anything that's simple, scientists will try to make it complicated. And so you really need to find out, to work out a few more of the details. And so what we're going to do is just to spend a little bit of time and look at the creation event and the different things that happened and see if we can get a little bit more of a handle on what we would expect to find in geology. Now, of course, the days of creation, the first day God made the heavens and the earth, significant from a geological perspective is on day 3 that God collected the waters together, let the waters be gathered together into one place, and the various events and the days of creation. So we can look at that creation event. Here we've got the time scale again, the day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and there's the various events which happened on the different days of creation. And from those different events that happened, the significant one, of course, was the geological event, which happened right at the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. And as a result of that, and then the other significant one, when God gathered the waters together. And so we can say, okay, the very initial thing, that there would have been a period when the foundational rocks, we could imagine that there would be certain rocks tied in with day 1 and 2, and the gathering, that there would be other rocks tied in with these gatherings on day 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so we can also actually, if we wanted to, we can divide up this little period a little bit more just for to be able to sort of go out into the field and see what we could expect to find. So there we've got the creation rocks. And of course, after God created everything, there was the first man and first woman took the fruit, they were thrown out of the garden, and then we read about the pre-flood era in those early chapters of Genesis. And at the beginning of that time, there were small populations and a limited extent. But at the end of that time, the Bible tells us that the whole earth, that mankind had grown on the earth. And over that period, there would have been some rocks which formed, we can imagine, we could call them the pre-flood rocks. Then we read about the flood, the global flood. And the Bible actually gives an amazing chronology of the flood. We can read there in Genesis chapter 6, 7, and 8, there about the flood. And we read about how it's all tied in to the age of Noah. We read there in the 2nd month, in the 17th day of the 600th year of Noah's life, we read that the fountains of the deep broke open. So the flood started, the rain lasted for 40 days, and the ark floated, came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And then as they were looking out the ark, it was another 2.5 months before the mountains were seen. And then eventually, after a whole year, Noah and his family disembarked from the ark. So we can do a similar thing with the flood event. We can tie in this flood event, the various events that happened, and very simply we can say, okay, there was a breaking up of the fountains of the deep. There must have been something which, caused the earth to break apart, an eruptive action, we could call that. And during that time, the earth became inundated with water. And while the earth was being inundated with water, there would have been rocks which were deposited, rocks which formed. And we can call them a very complicated name. We could call them inundatory rocks. And then we read about how God remembered Noah, and we read there how the fountains of the deep were stopped, and then the water started to flow off the earth, and it receded off the earth. It receded continually. So there was a recessive stage of the flood as the waters were going down, and the land was becoming dry. And we can call the rocks which formed at that stage simple term, the recessive stage. And again, if we wanted to, we could divide the various stages up into different parts and consider, just say, for example, 3 different parts at the beginning, the inundatory stage and the recessive stage. We could divide that up into 2 parts. It's interesting that as the waters receded off the face of the earth, there would have been a period where the whole earth was covered, and as the waters flowed off, it would have flowed off in large sheets of water that were flowing off into the oceans. And so I've called that the abative stage. And then there would have been a period as the waters eventually, as they were flowing, the flows would have broken into huge channels, which then would have cut large basins, large channels on the earth, a dispersive phase. And eventually, of course, the animals came off the ark, and after the flood was over, and we read about the rainbow and all the other things there, and how God said for the people to repopulate the earth. And so about 2500 BC, there are small populations of animals in the Middle East. Until today, we've got animals, large populations of peoples and animals all around the earth, all over the earth. And maybe after the flood, there might have been a period where the earth was settling down. There might have been instability. There might have been lots of earthquakes and volcanoes, sort of residual catastrophe after the flood. We could imagine that could happen. And then in the post-flood era, there would have been continued sort of things that have been happening to what we see happening today. So there we've got our little model. We've made it a little bit more complicated. We've got our time scale. We've got the sort of rocks we'd expect to find. And we've just done a little calculation to say, okay, this is what we'd expect to find because we believe the Bible's true. So we're wanting to teach geology to our students. We're wanting to understand geology and the rocks of the earth. This is what we'd expect to find. It's a biblical geological model. So we can then go out and have a look at the rocks. For example, these rocks of the Grand Canyon, and we can say, okay, let's try to understand how they formed as far as the flood was concerned. And this is a very interesting little exercise that creationists do. I think it's a little bit like reading a map. And you might have gone to a shopping centre, you go into a shopping centre, try to find your way around, and there's a little map that's at the entrance as you come in. You're very familiar with it. And one of the things when you walk in and have a look at this map, what do? You generally go and you sort of say, now where am I on this map? That's what you do. And generally there's a little sign which says, you are here. And so what you can do is you look at the map and you can see where you are on the map, and then you look around about yourself and you can sort of locate yourself in the shopping centre and you can find your way around. Now, can you just imagine a map that didn't have a "you are here" sign, or somebody had gone along and put various signs all around on this thing, "You are here, you are here, you are here, you are here," and you really don't know where you are. How do you work it out then? It's like that when you have a map and you go out into the, countryside and you try to find your way around. I've had the experience being out on a field trip and that sort of thing, where we've been in a group of 2 or 3 people. We've had this map and there's been considerable argument about where we are. And it's pretty important to figure out where you are. And somebody will say, well, I think we're here. Someone says, no, we're not here. That thing over there is not there. That we're actually here. And so the map's right, and we're looking around at the countryside. We just can't make that link to where we are. And it's a little bit like that with biblical geology. You have a look for various features around about that are on the map and you can identify. And so when we're looking at the rocks around on the world, how are we going to identify where these different rocks form, where they fit? And so what we do is we need to look at various characteristics. And there are many different characteristics that we could look at to try to be able to figure out where we are on our biblical geological model. One of the features is how big these rocks are, the scale of the rocks. And that's one of the classification criteria we can use. For example, there's the issue of the biblical history. Geological energy varied. There was a huge amount of geology happened in the creation week, and then not much happened in 1,700 years, and then a huge amount happened in creation, the flood, and not much happened after that. And so geological energy varied at different times of Earth history. And so we'd expect to find that certain rocks would have a huge scale. We'd find rocks maybe which stretch across continents, or maybe there might be rocks which cover large parts of continents, various sediments and different things. And we'd also we'd expect to find rocks of different scales that are on the Earth today. And by looking at how big these rocks are, how much of an area they cover, how thick they are, we'd be able to get a clue as to where perhaps they might fit. And so when we look at, say, the walls of the Grand Canyon, we can see that the rocks there are huge. You know, they're almost somewhere nearly a mile deep, aren't they? Something like that. And they cover, hundreds, maybe thousands of miles of area, many different states. We can see that these rocks are huge. And so they'd be tied in, they could be either creation rocks, being that size, or they could be flood rocks. It's hard to imagine that these sorts of huge amounts of sediments would form after the flood. It's just such a huge volume of sediment. That seems unreasonable. So from the scale of rocks that we look at, how big they are, we can get an idea as to where they might fit. Another classification criteria is disturbance. Now, we'd look at these rocks to see if they are disturbed and how they are disturbed, because there are various events that the Bible describes which would have disturbed rocks. When God said, let the waters be gathered together into one place, we can envisage that would have disturbed the rocks which are already there. Also, when the breaking up of the fountains of the great deep, that could have caused great disturbance to the rocks which were already present. And also during the flood, when the closing of the fountains of the great deep, that could have disturbed the rocks. And so we look at these particular rocks in the Grand Canyon and the walls there, and we can say, they're not particularly disturbed. They're still horizontal, and they're not bent and twisted. And so it doesn't look like those rocks have been through a great upheavals. And so we would expect them to be later rather than earlier in geologic events. A clue that maybe can give us an idea as to where they might fit. Another classification criteria is how these rocks respond to the disturbance. For example, you could have rocks which, when they are disturbed, they bend, they twist, they ooze, they're plastic in their response, and others which break, they're brittle. And we find in the earth there's many different rocks which are evidence of rocks which have bent when they've been plastic. We can see these particular rocks which have got these folds and twists and bends in them, that it's been, there's a plastic sort of response that has occurred. Whereas in other rocks, we can find in this little embankment here, and geologists like to have a look at these road cuts when they drive past, but you can see there's an example of a break that's occurred in a rock. It's technically known as a dike, a piece of rock which is the rock is broken and it's been intruded with another piece of rock. So there's been a brittle fracture there, and we can see another brittle fracture along the bottom there where it's actually displaced this dike. So we can get an idea for brittle response and also plastic response. So that's another clue. Another important clue that we can look at would be the issue of fossils. Ken's talked about those a lot. If there really was a worldwide flood, what would you expect to find? Billions of dead things. You can't expect to find fossils, dead things, in rocks which were formed before Adam and Eve sinned. And so when we find fossils, they can only occur after life was created. So when we look at these Grand Canyon rocks, we realize that they contain abundant fossils, dead things. And so we can say, well, that rules out that they were deposited during the creation event. It must have been after that. They're so large, it couldn't have been after the flood or between the creation and the flood. It must have been during the flood that these particular rocks were deposited. Footprints, that's another interesting feature where we can understand a little bit about the rocks. Footprints, we find footprints impressed in the rocks. And one of the things about footprints, you can only get a footprint when the animal's alive. And so that's a condition that gives us a little clue there. And so you wouldn't expect to find footprints in rocks which were deposited after the waters reached their peak. Because the Bible tells us that everything that had the breath of life perished. And so we can imagine that there might be a time when the waters were coming up on the earth, when animals were moving and fleeing from this flood, when there could have been footprints left. But after the waters reached their peak, and as the waters, when they were flowing off the earth, we wouldn't expect to find footprints. And as I say, we find footprints in many places around the earth. And this is a little reconstruction of dinosaurs making footprints in an area in Australia, in the state where I come from, in Queensland. But there are footprints found in a number of different layers or horizons in the Grand Canyon. And so we can understand from that, well, that these rocks must have been, been deposited as the floodwaters were coming up on the earth, rather than after the floodwaters had reached their peak and were flowing off the earth. And so when we look at, say, the flat layers of the Grand Canyon, in the walls of the Grand Canyon, we can see that the large scale points to creation or the flood. We can see that it contains fossils, so it's not the creation event, it must be the flood event. We can see that it contains footprints, so it can't be the recessive stage of the flood, it must be the inundatory stage. And so from doing these little clues, we can get an idea of how things fit into the biblical model. And there are other features and so we can say that somewhere in there, during the inundatory stage of the flood. Other criteria are coal. We find coal, and it represents vegetation that's buried during the flood and various processes that could have been involved in burying this vegetation. It doesn't take very long to form coal. It just requires the right conditions. A little bit of moderate heat, maybe some sort of catalyst, but with the right amount of heat, the coal can form within a few weeks, within a few months. And this is a coal deposit which is found in our country. You can see some quite thick layers or huge thicknesses of coal here, indicating large amounts of vegetation which were buried. And it gives us an idea as to, we know that it formed during the flood. There's another really interesting feature that we can look at, is the idea of native animals. We've got particular natives in animals in our country. Kangaroos is one, koalas are another. They're very cute for people who, kangaroos in our country, they're considered a pest often. The ranchers who are out there with their cattle, they don't like the kangaroos that come in and eat all the feed for the cattle. But various countries, as I say, have got different distinctive native animals. Now, when you find rocks which contain fossils of native animals, that raises an interesting question. For example, in Australia, we find there's certain rocks which contain fossils of kangaroos. And so it's hard to imagine that before the flood, the kangaroos migrated from Australia to the Middle East to hop on Noah's Ark. And then after the flood, they migrated back to Australia after the flood so that they could form a fossil, isn't it? It's a very, very tall order, isn't it? So you could say, well, okay, if there are rocks containing fossils of animals which are native to a particular country, then you'd expect that those rocks are probably formed in some sort of a post-flood event. So with native animals, post-flood rocks, we'd expect to find the fossils that they contain, generally, would be, the animal fossils would be similar to the sort of natives that are in the land in general. But whereas the rocks which formed during the flood, we would not necessarily expect that the fossils that they contain really are the same necessarily as the native animals within the land. And so we've looked at a few criteria. There's dozens of different criteria that we can use as we look in at different rocks. But we've got this biblical geological model, which we have. And so we've developed it from just simple ideas, developed a little framework where we can look at the rocks. And from that particular geological model, we can understand how the Bible links in with geology. So that instead of, a teacher saying, I don't know how to teach my children about geology, I can teach them what's in the textbook, and then I say we don't believe that. We can teach them something which is concrete, teach them something so that they can go out and understand the world around about them. I sometimes run some sort of a field trips with people during, say, a creation camp or something like that. And we'll go out and have a look at the rocks of the country, and use this little model to explain where the rocks fit in. And as people can understand how the different rocks fit in and the timing of them and how geologists work out where the different events happen, and then see how it fits in with the flood, people's eyes are like being opened. And I've had one person say to me that after going on such a field trip, he says, now whenever I go around the countryside and drive around, I can just see the evidence of the flood everywhere. So that's the real power of these little models and that sort of thing, is that we can use them in our day-to-day life, use them in teaching, use them in understanding the world around about us. Biblical geological model, it helps us understand geology. It's a practical tool for research, and it actually can give us new insights into the sort of things we could expect to find, and it allows for scientific discussion. And so when we start with, say, a geological map, and when different people come from different parts of the world, you come from different areas, and you don't often find creationist books on the geology of your area. I mean, when I was interested in geology, I couldn't go and find a creationist geological book about the geology of my area. But you can find lots of resources for the geology of your different area. You can buy them at your, various bookshops and that sort of thing. They're often generally available. And you can get these resources sometimes from your geological departments. Some of the government departments, they'll have maps and various resources which you can get. It's all presented within an evolutionary framework, of course. But once you've got a model in your mind as to what you can expect to find, you can go to these various maps and you can then reinterpret them within a biblical framework. And it really it's not particularly difficult. There's various things that you look at, of course. You say, well, these particular rocks, how big are these? Do they just localize, or do they extend over several states? You can have a look at the scale of them, and you can be alert looking for the presence of footprints or various things like that, so you can understand where things fit together. So you have a geological map like this, standard map. And what really would be great is when we can get our maps, which also include a biblical scale on them, so that people when people look at these maps, they can see, those particular rocks, they were formed as the floodwaters were rising. These particular rocks, they were formed as the floodwaters were receding, and then these particular rocks were formed after the flood. And as Keith Wanser said, it adds plausibility because we can give those sorts of details. So a biblical geological model, and it actually applies the actual geology to local areas by using available resources, and we can develop more classification criteria, different things to be able to identify the rocks, and it'd be great to publish various maps and handbooks with these sorts of information on it and have wide use. It just will communicate the creationist message in such a wider way. And whenever we go in tourism, we might visit a cave or we might go to a certain area, there's always the interpretive signs, aren't there, which say, well, 65 million years ago this particular thing happened. But we can then reinterpret those things and we can produce our own interpretive information. So we've just gone through this morning looking at a biblical geological model to answer the issue or the question when people say, well, I know what's wrong. I look in the textbook and I understand that and I know it's wrong, but I don't know where it's wrong. So it's providing a biblical framework so that we can understand, and when we read this secular material, we can be able to be discerning, and we can find the material which provides the evidence, and we can find the material which is just secular interpretation, and then we'll be able to understand things from a biblical perspective. So I hope that'll be helpful to you, and that's my presentation on a biblical geological model.